Hey, all you writers out there, we've all been there. We're writing something and we're just not loving it. It's drudgery. We're trying to plow through, get it done, but something is saying, I just don't love this. It doesn't feel authentic. Tonight, you're going to meet a writer who's going to share with us the importance of loving what we write with authenticity and passion. Welcome to Writer Talks. I'm Elizabeth Ann Atkins, and here at Two Sisters Writing and Publishing, I interview the winners of our monthly short story contests. Today, I'm so thrilled to talk with and introduce to you E.K. Singer. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi.
It's really cool to talk to somebody who has the same name as me, Elizabeth Ann.
Yes. Good name. Solid.
Very solid, as is your winning story, Dust, published in our International Anthology of Short Story Winners, right behind you on the shelf in your beautiful office. So, can you talk about how you came to be a writer, Elizabeth?
Oh, sure. So I was thinking about this question and I really realized there wasn't ever a time that I wasn't a writer. I think it all comes at various times in our lives. And I remember in fourth grade putting together a story anthology for all my fellow fourth graders that we all wrote short stories and put them in an anthology.
I love
And
it.
yeah, and we called it writing stuff in true fourth grade, late 1980s stuff. No, it was 1990s by then. But I think really when I became a writer, I was in college and I was a poli-sci and identity studies major. And I really thought I was going to do policy work on Capitol Hill. I was pretty active with that group. And I remember a professor of mine in the English department. I had worked for the newspaper in college and did some general writing there. And she had this flyer for the Poynter Institute. They do a fellowship they pick, I think there's 12 of us, graduates to come down and do an intensive journalism fellowship with them. And she sent me the physical flyer through the intercampus mail with this little post-it that says, I think you could get this. And I was like, okay, you're a college senior, you really don't know what you're going to do. So I sent in a bunch of stuff and then I completely forgot about it for months. And then I won one of the fellow spots.
Wow,
So
congratulations.
from there, I kind of everything just sort of tumbled that direction. So it never really was a chosen career. It kind of chose me. And I became a journalist and started writing for money. And I was sort of the opposite, where a lot of people fall into writing and then hope to make money. I fell into writing as a job and then realized, oh, I really like this. So that was kind of the start of being a writer. I guess it would be the way that it is. But when I look back now, I realize I was always a writer. I was always a huge reader, as we all are. Typically, that's usually where we find it.
So we also, in addition to a name, we share the background of being journalists and then transitioning into writing fiction. So can you talk about the rigid rules of journalism where you have to get the facts correct, whereas in fiction you can just make stuff up? Talk about the freedom and excitement of that.
Well, those skills though, oh wow, are they applicable? I remember writing for the newspaper, and one of the things that they never tell you, I quickly transitioned to magazines. So I was upstate New York for the Democrat and Chronicle, and then I moved back to Minnesota and worked in the magazine world. And magazines loved newspaper reporters because they got details. And really, when you think about a great story, it's those little tiny details, but not too many of them, that illuminate an entire character.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I really love about transitioning to fiction was the idea that I could take this skill of finding detail and then putting it into a short story. So I really think that the journalism set me up for those things. Now I notice when you're trying to describe someone, for example, at least I pick out, and like writers that I like pick out those little details that illuminate everything. And they don't need very much. It's almost like your mind fills in the blanks. You only need a few key little moments. And I think that journalism does the same thing, because it does teach you to get all of those, the below the iceberg.
Yes.
Like we know all those things, but they don't all make it into the newspaper copy. Right. I think the same happens with fiction, all this stuff, and then it helps build the story. So I think the foundations are the same. And then I just happen to make up the story versus actually reporting on something that happened. So yeah.
I love it. I love it. Okay, let's talk about your story, Dust.
Yeah.
Where did you get that idea?
So again, save your work, writers. I was literally dusting one day. The opening lines of this story: chunks of dust fell from the bathroom light, feathery and unexpected. That was me dusting my light fixture in the bathroom.
That's so beautiful, though. It's so beautifully written. I love it. Your details are just so vibrant.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, and I was on the counter, and I don't have a particularly glamorous house, just a lovely little small house. And the light fixture was up, and I remember I was on my knees on the counter, dusting. It was like this 4-bulb, like 1980s brass thing. I don't know. We have kind of an older house. And this dust fell, and I stopped, and my kids were really young at the time. This was a long time ago. And I got down, and I remember I wrote it on a piece of paper, like just that opening line.
Wow.
Later, I sat down and wrote it typed it out, and a couple other lines, saved it in a folder of just random musings that I have. I didn't touch it for 7 years. Like, this was that long ago.
Wow.
And I just left it. And then one day when I was sitting, really kind of looking for inspiration and just sort of mucking around in my old folders, I saw this Word doc with this stuff on it. And then I just started to riff on it. I, just started to find the path that it wanted me to go on. And then it became what it is. It was much longer before. I challenged myself to really try to get it down. I think it's Flashlight. I think it's pretty short. I mean, if it's 500 words, it's barely there.
Yeah. Would you like to read some or all of it?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
But it was much longer before, and it was a nice challenge to get it short. So
okay.
Yes, it shouldn't take very long.
All right.
Chunks of dust fell from the bathroom light, feathery and unexpected, tiny pieces of death suspended in midair, like small bits of compost decaying under the weight of temperature and time. The air in the bathroom grew hazy as Linda's cloth wiped, the dust stirring and lifting, a snow shower of gray. She paused, bringing her hand up to one of the floating gray specks, the small, hairy tendrils of fuzz perched on the skin of her fingertip. Perhaps some of this tiny ball was from her own lungs, particles from her own breath, her cries, her screams, and pieces of him, nails, hair, skin, forensic memory of his concealed crimes. Blowing the gray clump off her finger, she let it join its discarded brethren on the counter below. Any lingering remnants of him should be discarded into the trash. Trash. He had once called her that. Trash, like she should be thrown away. Garbage. Never again. Dusting complete, the night wrapped around her, the winter chill of late January gripping the empty house. Linda left, as she did every Wednesday, for the support group in the Methodist church basement. How are you? The women always asked that. They asked everyone that. I'm okay, Linda would say. He's gone. The same answer every week. He's never coming back. Are you sure? They ask. Yes, Linda would nod, take a sip of coffee, her voice steady. Yes, he's gone for good. For good. The words swirled around her as she stood outside her front door. Linda's breath fogged, crystallized heaviness in bitter cold air, now swirling with snow flurries. Turning her head, Linda looked at the yard, to the thick trees. Bright light from the full moon cut through the sparse tree limbs like shards, piercing the snowy ground. She was grateful that the snow covered the settled, shoveled dirt underneath. Very little could hide on winter nights like this, the shadows thin and haphazard, making the forest look like skeletons. You could see the bones of everything. Snowflakes lingered in the air as they increased in number. Linda held her gloved hand out, watched as a bright white clump found her fingertip. For a moment it perched, waiting in a silent, icy inertia. Linda knew how to wait. She had waited many times before, in this house, for his rage and insults and fists to stop, for a time when she wouldn't hurt. Sometimes it was less painful to surrender, to wait until he finished, until the dust settled. Linda returns her gaze to the skeletal trees and thinks of bones, of death, the frames of human bodies. His body. How long would she wait for a body to decay, to decompose under the weight of temperature and time? When does it become dirt, dung? When does it become dust?
Wow. 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 So that's so cool how a simple word, dust, inspired by cleaning, inspires the whole ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and the implication of what may have occurred that she's waiting to turn to dust. That was beautiful. Beautiful. I love it. That was so well done.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you.
welcome. You're welcome. So tell me how you feel when you said you love something that you're writing versus not feeling it.
I think it's and we talked about this earlier, and I know lots of your writers have talked about it. There is a passion part, that there's a part of us as writers that even as I look to my career, it sort of chose me rather than me choosing it. I think stories do that, depending on, I mean, it's not necessarily a faith or a spiritual thing, but it definitely, there is a flow, and there is a reasoning, and there is a rhythm that comes from, all of a sudden it just sort of comes out. And I know some writers feel like they really channel this. And with this story, I think I did too. So love is like this all-encompassing word. Like, I don't necessarily know if I love Linda's story, but I couldn't stop it. Like, it's sort of, so it's a love of sort of the process. So for me, when I'm writing something, if it doesn't, I still have to write through some of the muck to kind of get to it. But if it doesn't feel like, if I'm sleepy when I'm writing it, I just sort of walk away, and I'm like, we need to find a different time. And maybe it's not even the material. Maybe it's something that's just happening in my life at the time. But loving something, I feel like it just sort of comes. And that's where the authenticity piece, I think, comes in too, that I know we talked about, but I sort of wrapped around a question. But yeah, I think, and if you're going to spend time with something, you better just love it. Our time is precious. And if you're really forcing something, I feel like that comes through, that's coded on the page, I think, sometimes. And when we read something, we can just tell that this writer loved creating this and loved spending time with these people. And even if their story is hard or dark or twisty, they just had a real reverence for the things in the world that they were creating. So
I love it.
Yeah.
And one of the ways you do that is in writing romance. Can you talk about that?
Okay. So first love and always love romance novels. I've read probably thousands of them. Just that is definitely my love, which is absolutely ridiculous because this story is the very opposite.
Yeah, exactly. But you know what? I've interviewed a lot of romance writers who say that they started writing romance while they were going through a divorce or recovering
Mhm.
from abuse. So it really is an elixir to the negativity of love gone wrong.
Yeah, well, and I think too that there's something to be said for sort of this. It isn't a resurgence because romance is always the best-selling genre and always is such a huge part of publishing, but it finding more commercial just visibility, maybe. I don't even know what the word would be, but because there are really hard things in the world right now, and there's really a lot of both greater giant trauma, small traumas, just there's a lot happening. And to find a story that you know is going to end in a happy way, and for people, even if their their tale gets dark and twisty and it's, dramatic and takes you through the emotional ringer, at the end there's going to be a happily ever after. And there's something so affirming and comforting in that. And that I just like that. I've noticed that most of my longer things, I can't not write a happily ever after. In some ways, Linda had a happily ever after in this story, that she found her own way through, moral questions aside, but she found a way to carve some piece of happiness in the icy January day, that she is somehow free of the things that oppressed her, at least in a small way. So
Mhm.
that's what romance really does for me. That it's a place that I go. I'm in a very prolific romance book club that we read a lot, and I've got a lot of comfort reads, and I'm so grateful to those authors for creating those worlds, because it's so nice to have those places to go. It's a comforting place. So that's why I love romance. That's why I write it. That's why I read it. So yeah,
That's beautiful. I love it. Are you writing a romance novel now?
I do. Yeah, I've got one inquiry right now. That's 1920s prohibition historical fiction.
Ooh.
It crosses over to women's fiction. I know that's always a bit of a wobbly line, but it does have a happily ever after. The love story is part of the central plot, so that's where the crossover comes in. But those were characters that sometimes I couldn't even shut them up. you just I just felt like there were parts of it that just had to go. Like I just followed them down and the path. So yeah.
Mhm. I love it. Now let's talk about the 20s because it was the
Yes.
roaring 20s. Women were being liberated with hairstyles and dresses and dancing and smoking
Yeah.
and drinking, even though it was illegal. So talk about how fun that is.
It is fun, and it's really layered, because you had this roaring 20s thing, and the prohibition was just a giant exercise in hypocrisy, because you had booze was illegal. Technically transporting it was illegal, but there was some things there. But then you had this huge party scene, and then there was part of what laid the groundwork for it was this idea of the early 20th century, that women were starting to get a foothold in society and starting to be doctors and lawyers. And that's a little bit of the main characters in my book are all women that have professional ambition. And with that becomes family planning and, domestic abuse, which drinking was a huge part of that. So some ways prohibition turned that a little bit, but then it became an even greater problem. But there's so much just after World War One, and there's a huge influx of immigration. So there's all this exciting mixtures of cultures, and there's class divides. I mean, it's just got everything, like most time periods do, but it's a time period that there's just this glamour and glitz edge to so many things in the 20s that is
Mhm.
that is true. And there's that smuggling and all those other things that came with
Yeah,
the
that's
10
fun.
years
Yeah.
of prohibition. But then they learned to smuggle other things, and it's the start of a lot of the women's healthcare movement, reproductive healthcare movement, because if you can smuggle booze, what else can you smuggle? You can smuggle birth control. And then you set up illegal birth control clinics and ways for women to care for other women across all class and racial lines. And so what laid the groundwork for that is all those kinds of movements of society and the way that we sort of stretched in those that 10 years. But it's a fun time period. There's a lot happening in rural America. There's a lot happening in the cities. It just, yeah, it's just so vibrant.
I love it. That's super exciting. So
Yeah.
your goal is to get your novel published.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so here's another interesting thing about you is that you have a full-time job and a family,
Yeah.
and you're
Uh-huh.
still able to crank out the fiction. So how do you do
Yeah.
that?
I don't sleep a lot right now.
Oh,
Yeah, but we all don't. Again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. Like, I just gotta love it. I do remember I just upped my professional, and I have novelist and then I've got corporate work. So I upped that schedule mostly because I also love that piece of it. I love what I do for my clients. And I remember thinking, well, I better really love my fiction writing, because if I'm going to spend time with these people, I want to, I want to spend time. It's like a great book,
yes. Yeah.
So it helps sort out that authenticity pretty quickly. Cause if I don't love it, I'm not going to spend time on it, because I don't really have a lot of time to spare. So
Right.
yes. Yeah.
Yes. Wow,
Yeah.
fascinating. So what tips can you offer to writers to really, really love their
Mm.
work and not do anything, especially if it's fiction or a passion project
Mm.
that you just don't love?
I'm a big fan of our creative lives are very holistic. So baking and hiking and being in nature and doing art all feed on each other. It's a big sphere. It's not a either and. So if I'm struggling, I usually just leave it and go try to do something else. That's hard on deadline, as journalism, like teaches you you better just bust on through and get that done. And in some
That's
ways,
right.
sometimes that's what you need, even if it's just a scene of he says this, she says this, he said, I have definitely had scenes like that just to get through it, because once
Uh-huh.
you get on page, it's so much easier to do something. So
Mhm.
two things: decide in the moment, do I need to push through this or do I need to leave it?
Oh,
Because
okay.
sometimes done is better than good. Like, sometimes getting it done is what you need to see, and then it becomes something else.
Right.
Um, and then sometimes I just have to leave it and go do something else. I think it's Cameron Hurley, or there's a science fiction writer that talks a lot about this, where she will literally just go, I'm bored with this scene, so someone else is going to be bored with it, so I'm just going to leave it. And she'll
Right.
just leave it there. She won't do it, never. And the other lesson is never erase anything. If I can tell with this dust story, I mean, I left it for 7 years. It went through two laptops, just file transfer over.
Uh-huh.
And I finally found it again. And so, yeah, probably figure out if you need to bust through it, do something else, and never have a whole, I mean, you probably do this too. I have a whole Word document of cuts from stuff.
Yeah, I do
Like
that
this
too.
story,
Yeah.
this story
Yeah.
was so much longer, and I just kept it in a
Yeah.
different file, named it cuts, or
Yeah.
people sometimes name them pieces, or I don't know. They name all
Yep.
kinds of things.
Totally.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do
Because
that
then,
too.
yeah,
It's like
sometimes
you're
you find good stuff in there too.
you
Because
do,
you're
you
like,
do. And
oh,
plus you invested your brain power into every sentence, every phrase. You're not just going to delete it.
right. Yes. And it's creation is there. Like, it may be that it didn't need to be there, it needed to be over here.
Right.
So it just sort of came out, and then you moved it over. So
Mhm.
yes.
Mhm.
I have a girlfriend of mine who's a chef, and she says that sometimes when she doesn't have a cake turnout, she's like, that's what trifles are for. She just cuts it up, puts it in a bowl with frosting and fruit, and just turns it around, and she's like, it still tastes good.
Uh,
So
That's
So
awesome.
yeah, so I think about that a lot when I'm
Uh-huh.
creating, that sometimes it just isn't supposed to be this, it's supposed to be this. And
Mhm.
you just needs to morph a little bit or pivot. So,
That's awesome. I love it. I love the creative process and how we all
mm,
have similarities and differences, but we all get to the same place of creating something awesome to share with other people.
mhm.
So, Elizabeth, do you do any other kind of writing? Like, do you write poetry or journaling or nonfiction?
Um, no. Previously as a nonfiction journalist, and um, I write for my day job too, day job, sort of main job. Who knows what word I should use? I journal as a general, more of a spiritual practice. That I find really helpful. I have also done, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way.
Mhm.
Yeah. I have actually found sometimes it's hard to be a writer and then do a journaling practice because we think so writing. So I've had sometimes where people say you should do a different practice to sort of use different parts of your brain. But I don't write poetry. I love poets though, and I find poetry and songwriting fascinating because I don't know if I could ever do them. And the people who do that are magnificently talented. So
Yeah.
I appreciate poetry. I read it, but I don't write it. So
So,
yeah.
how is journaling a spiritual practice for you?
Hmm. I journal every morning when I sit down. One of the things that I have been able to carve out in my day is my mornings are pretty precious, especially with kids, school, work, family life. I'm an early riser. So getting up and having even just that 20, 30 minutes of just quiet in the morning is a really reverent place for me. So getting up and journaling about anything that sort of spews out. Sometimes there's a question, sometimes I work with a particular topic of like right now, because it's we're coming up on the equinox and it's a real turning season. Um, Thinking about transition, back to school, new rhythms, finding new ways of doing the same things, really seeing what works, what doesn't. So lately that's been the journaling practice, but it kind of shifts, you know, every sort of season has its own little rhythm that sort of
Mhm.
comes to me. So
Mhm. I love that you
yeah.
say that because for me, journaling is deeply spiritual. It's a
Mm,
gratitude, it's expression, it's a reflection. And when you do automatic writing, when you allow your
mm-hmm,
intuition to speak and like pour or channel through without your thinking mind interfering with what you're writing, it's magical. You can get
mm-hmm,
ideas, you can get clarity. It's an amazing practice. You just have to get still and silent and really, like you said, the morning routine and the precious time to alone.
mm.
It's amazing. So
It
there's so
is.
many. Yeah, I'm really excited that you do that because it helps your
Yeah.
creative process and it gives you clarity for the rest of whatever you're doing that day.
Yeah. And it really does sort of almost sometimes serve as a filter of sort of the not the junk, but just to kind of have a safe place for it to live. And
Mm-hmm.
then you can just go and create and have the creativity be a little bit more clear and
Mm-hmm.
not have this stuff mucking it up.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
yeah, yep.
Yeah,
I love that.
beautiful. Is there any last thing you'd like to share, Elizabeth, about your writing process or your big dreams?
Hmm. I am immensely grateful for all the instructors, all like the fact that writing found me versus I found writing. And I'm just immensely grateful for the community. Your community, there's a romance novel community, the Authors Guild. There's so many great places to reach out and I, have inclusive communities of all walks of writers, all writers at every level. So I think that that's super important because
Hmm.
I do think creation is a magical process. It can be a spiritual process, but we're really blessed as humans to be able to do it. So I find I'm great. I'm just really grateful for everything that I've done and everything that I will do. So thanks for
Oh,
providing the space for it. I think it's great.
oh, Thank you so much. What a beautiful way to
Yeah.
end, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
E.K. Singer, author of Dust in the Two Sisters in Writing and Publishing International Anthology of Short Story Winners, right above her shoulder and at twosisterswriting.com. So please pick up your copy. It's on Amazon. You can get it, read it, and you can read her awesome story that she read to us that has so many layers of meaning.
Mm,
I love that. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I please
yeah.
keep in touch and I wish you the absolute best.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you, all of you, for joining us here on Writer Talks, where you got to meet E.K. Singer, the author of Dust, who is featured in our international anthology of short story writers who win our monthly contests. So you should hop over to twosisterswriting.com and enter. Click on submissions and see what contests we have going on. There are a whole bunch, and that will be your opportunity to possibly get published in our anthology. Please also give us a big thumbs up to like this interview. Subscribe to the channel so you can watch Writer Talks every Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And also follow me on Twitter at Elizabeth Atkins and at Two Sisters Writing. That's the number Two Sisters Writing. So meanwhile, I wish you happy writing and happy reading. I'll see you next.